webinar series. Today is our 8th webinar series, and we will talk with Ivy Barrymore from Mar Alliance about our project, Deepwater Fish and Fisheries in the Mesoamerican Region. We want to share with you today a couple of instructions. The idea is that if you do not speak English or you prefer the Spanish translation, you can go in the Zoom controls, click under interpretation, and choose the language. So I'll do that in Spanish if someone is on this channel. Si necesita encontrarnos en idioma español, ustedes tienen que buscar en los controles de Zoom, buscar interpretación y hacer clic en el idioma que desea escuchar. Y para que no tenga ruido, pueden apagar el audio original, ¿verdad? Como se explica aquí en esta diapositiva. Very well. A few basic rules for the webinar. We encourage a space for learning and respect. We will ask you to disable microphones and camera during the webinar and ask you to write your full name, country, and organization in the chat if you are here in the Zoom. You can write your question at any time and we will respond them at the end. If you are listening by Facebook Live, you can submit your question through the Facebook comment section. And if you need or would like to hear the webinar in Spanish, you can connect through the Zoom link. At the end, we'll do like a question and answer section, sorry, and we will allow Ivy to respond any question or query you might have. So, welcome again. Today, speaker is Ivy Barrymore. She is graduated from Florida State University with a bachelor's degrees in biological science. She has been the biological technician for the National Marine Fisheries Service in Panama City for 3 years. In 2006, she received the master's degree from the University of Florida, and she worked on commercial and recreational landings and life history biology of shark species in support of stocks assessment. In 2013, she moved to Belize and became technical coordinator with Mar Alliance, and she started in 2019 a part-time PhD with the University of Exeter and moved to Honduras. And some of the results today she will present to us are also part of this work. So Mar Alliance, who is a Mar Alliance? Mar Alliance is an NGO, international grassroots NGO working in Belize, Panama, Honduras, Mexico, Cuba, Cabo Verde, the US, and Micronesia. Mar Alliance conducts participatory scientific monitoring of threatened marine wildlife, working directly with traditional fishers and community members to collect data. Its mission is to explore, enable, and inspire positive changes for threatened marine wildlife, critical habitats, and dependent human communities. And today, Ivy will speak a little bit about her work and a project that was supported by MARFON. If you want to know more about our webinar series, please check our Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, as well as our webpage, where you can find previous events recordings. So that's it from my side. I will leave the floor to Ivy. Welcome, Ivy. I'll stop sharing my presentation. Hi, Ivy.
Hello. Hi, thanks everyone for coming. Let me go ahead and share my screen to make sure we are on the right path.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
you are good to go. Thank you so
Okay.
much and welcome again.
All right, thanks so much. As Elisa mentioned, I'll be talking about deepwater fish and fisheries in the Mesoamerican region. And I do include Spanish on many of the slides, but I will be giving my presentation in English. I'm going to just jump right in because I do have a lot of ground to cover here. So the seminar will be presented basically in two parts. The first section of the talk is to describe the history and the contemporary status of the deepwater fishery in the 4 countries that make up the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, including Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. And I will talk about the differences in the fisheries among the countries and the perceptions of the fishers. Second part of the presentation will be about the investigation of the fish, their abundance, distribution, how old do they get, where are the areas that are most important to them. And this will lead into a discussion of the potential for management and the conservation measures and what this might look like for the fishers. And finally, what is the future of the fishery and what does sustainability in this fishery look like? Before we dive into the deepwater fisheries, let's talk about a little bit about why we need to investigate them in the first place. So this is a news item from 2011. It came out in the news, Science News, and it says deep sea fish in trouble. Scientists find that nearly all deep sea fisheries are unsustainable. So firstly, what does sustainable mean? Essentially, it means that we can expect that future generations can expect to see the same number and sizes of fish that we do today. And why would deepwater fisheries be unsustainable? The problem with the deepwater fishes is that they tend to be long-lived, slow to reproduce, and to grow slowly. All of these factors mean that they are less likely to be able to recover from overfishing. For example, the groupers are a good example of a group of fish that are slow growing, late maturing, and they're often the first species to be removed in coastal fisheries. The black grouper, for example, is a common species in the Caribbean, and it can live to be more than 30 years old, and it matures around 5 years of age. In contrast, one of its deep water counterparts, yellow edge grouper, can live for more than 80 years. And so when you're eating something that can be as old as your grandfather, that's probably not a great thing. In the Mesoamerican region, these are the species that are representative of the target and the bicot species in the deepwater fishery. They range from about 50 meters down to about 500 meters. The sharks go much deeper than that. But the problem here is that we have very little information about these species. And so many are listed as data deficient or of least concern. And this is not necessarily that we're not concerned about the species, but more that we don't have enough information about them to be able to, there's a helicopter going by, about information to be able to assess their vulnerability or their life history. While species such as the groupers and some of the sharks are near threatened and vulnerable, and some of the groupers and shark species are actually listed as endangered to extinction. So because there's so little information on these species and the threats in the region, we don't know how vulnerable they are to overfishing.
Very good.
There's also no specific management measures in place for these species in any of the 4 countries in the Mesoamerican region. So we talk about overfishing, but what does that look like? Essentially, when a fishery first begins and everybody goes out and starts fishing, they kind of expect to catch these big fish and to be in pretty big abundance. And then as we move over this side to more years of fishing, more and more people are getting into the fishery, and they're fishing more and they're catching more fish. And essentially over time, the average size of the fish landed becomes smaller and smaller, and the largest fish are removed from the population. So the problem here is that we need those big fish to maintain the population. So first of all, of course, if you're catching only the small fish before they have a chance to reproduce, they're not replacing themselves. So if you remove all the kids before they are able to replace themselves, then you're not going to have any adults in the future. Secondly, we really need the buffs, the big old fat females in the population. That's these guys up here, because lots of studies have shown that these older, fatter females produce not only more eggs, but they have more fat in them, and they produce offspring that are more likely to survive because they're of higher quality. So in summary, long-lived fish tend to reproduce later in life, and they are not able to recover from overfishing. Overfishing means that there are fewer fish and they are smaller for the fishers, which leads to higher effort for the fishers to catch fewer fish. Longer fit trips, more fuel used, and therefore less profit for the fishers. It also means that fishing may not be a good occupation for future generations. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about the importance of studying the deepwater fish species, we'll move into the first part of the talk, which is the characterization of the fishery. So this first part of the presentation is summarized actually in a paper that came out in 2021 that is called the Fishing Down the Reef Slope, and it is essentially the characteristics of the deepwater fishery in the 4 countries, Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. We conducted 122 surveys across the 4 countries to assess the history, the current trends, the prices, and the perceptions of the fishers about the status and the future of deepwater fisheries. So each of these yellow triangles here represent areas where we conducted interviews with fishers. And then here's a map for reference. The colors will follow through for the countries for the rest of this section. So Mexico will always be red, Belize green, Guatemala orange, and Honduras will be blue. The first thing to notice here is on this map is this gray bar that runs down along the coast, along the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef. And this represents essentially the available habitat for the fish species between around 100 and 500 meters. This is the depth preferences of these fish where they can live. It also represents, because of that, the fishing grounds for the deepwater fishers. And then I want you, so notice that that's a narrow band. So the exclusive economic zones for the countries are here, and this band of deepwater habitat available is very small. And then one of the first questions that we asked of the fishers was the age of, the number of years that they had been fishing. So this is reflective a bit of their age, and it also gives a good idea of sort of the age of the fishery. So for instance, when you look here, you'll see that there's a lot of green representing Belize on the left-hand side of this, the years of deepwater fishing, and then a lot of blue on the right-hand side representing Honduras. And then you'll see that there really aren't many fishers that have in Belize that say that they have been fishing for more than 20 years. So this means that the fishery is not really very well established. It wasn't established in past generations, whereas you can see the entire age range is represented in Honduras. So the fishers in Belize have fewer than 20 years under their belts, and there's not a long history of fishing in Belize. And therefore, there's no generational knowledge really being passed down to the fishers of Belize about deepwater fishing. The next couple of slides represent answers to open-ended questions, which I have summarized in these categories. On the left-hand side is the country where the fishermen lived, and on the right-hand side is the answer that they give. So if you follow the bar across, that gives the answer, and again, it's color-coded, and the thicker the bar, the more people answered that question. And the first thing that stood out to me was that overall, you'll see there's 4 bars that are very thick that all lead to this first answer here. Most of the motivation, or one of the prime motivations for all fishers across all countries was some form of curiosity. Most fishers said that they just wanted to see what was down there. They wanted to be the first person to see something new in the depth. After curiosity, and again, the fishers often gave more than one answer. So this doesn't represent one person per answer. So the next one, unsurprisingly, is that the fish were bigger and there were more of them, and this related to it being more profitable. The other thing here, you would notice that the no alternative answer is primarily from fishers from Mexico and Honduras, where they basically said, there's nothing else to do. That's the reason that I'm in the fishery. Next, we wanted to determine what the most common fishing gear were by country. And for the most part, fishers used vertical long lines, which is a line that has some kind of an anchor at the bottom and multiple hooks that sits vertical in the water column. And that was pulled either by hand or with a winch. Mexico really was the main country using bottom long line. Guatemala was the only country that reported using gill nets in the deep sea, and that's primarily to target sharks. And then something also you notice in Honduras is that there's a lot of hook and line fishers. So hook and line is different from vertical long line, and that hook and line tends to be 1 to 3 hooks. It's held at the surface by hand, and you feel a bite and you haul it up. So it's a bit smaller scale. And so these fishers would represent the sort of more subsistence fishers. And then here we wanted to find out whether the fishers were full-time deep water fishers or what other fisheries they participated in. So what we found is that unsurprisingly, most fishers also fish for finfish in shallow waters. And you see that across all 4 countries. But what I want to point out here is that in Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala, most of the fishers also reported fishing for lobster and conch. You see that much less so in Honduras, and that has to do with the nature of the lobster and conch fisheries. Honduras is a very different lobster fishery. It's more industrial. The guys go out and live on the boats for months at a time during the season. Whereas in the top 3 countries, it's more free diving and smaller scale. Yeah, and then there is also a semi-industrial fishery for deep water fisheries in Honduras, where the fishers go out for multiple days or weeks on snapper boats. All right, so the next one is, when do you prefer to fish in deep water? And so to orient you to this figure, the months are along the top, and the fishers reported preferring to fish in the months where there is a blue box. So again, kind of leading from that previous slide, we found that the fishers in Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala, and this gray bar here underneath it represents the close season for lobster and conch. So the fishers in Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala reported preferring to fish in deeper waters during the close season for conch, whereas the fishers in Honduras reported preferring to fish all months, but especially actually during the fall months, the hurricane season. And if we notice on the bottom, this is the average wind speed in the region. You can see that the fishers in Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala are choosing to fish, or they are fishing during the months when the wind is the highest, whereas in Honduras, they're able to selectively fish in the times when it's actually better for deep sea fishing, when the winds are lower. Next, we asked the fishers where they sell their fish, and here most fishers reported that they sold directly to consumers, whether they were individuals or restaurants. Honduras is the only country that has a robust export market. There's a small cooperative in Belize that exports primarily to Jamaica, but for the most part, the fishers are either finding individuals or local markets or restaurants to sell directly to. The next few slides are about the perceptions from the fishers. So the answers here were a Likert scale. So on the left, each one of the answers on the left is strongly disagree, disagree, neutral or don't know, agree, and strongly agree. So for simplicity's sake, I've basically put all of the disagrees as a no answer and all of the agree answers as a yes answer. So when we asked the fishers, is it easier to catch fish in deep waters than in shallow waters? Very unsurprisingly, across the board, everybody said, no, it's not easier. It's much harder. It's harder to get out, harder to get the gear. You have to burn more fuel. It's not an easy fishery. The next question we asked was if the fishery needed management. And there was a pretty large number here actually of yes answers. But when we asked a few follow-up questions about this and what they meant, a lot of it had to do with limiting illegal fishing and transboundary fishing. You see that here the Mexican fishers mostly said that no, they don't need any management. Most of the fishers in this survey were part of a very successful cooperative where they kind of manage their own conch and lobster stocks. So it's not really surprising that they don't think that they need management. And then when we asked if there were more fish now than when they first started fishing, most fishers, you could see Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras said no. The Belizean fishers were pretty much evenly split between yes and no, but the majority of them answered don't know. And again, that's not surprising because this is not a very old fishery. So they can't think back 30 years ago because these guys weren't really fishing in deep waters 30 years ago. And finally, when we asked if they would be fishing more in deep water in the future, the overwhelming across the countries was either yes or I don't know. Very few no answers here. So in summary, we found that there are a number of different gears that are being used across the countries, but vertical longline was the most common across all countries. Most fishers sold directly to individuals or to restaurants, and only the fishers in Guatemala reported using gill nets, and they're mostly to target sharks at certain times of the year. Although that being said, the Mexican fishers would land sharks if they were caught. Only Honduras has a semi-industrial fishery, and it's the only country that is exporting, has a robust export market. There's also a very robust internal market whereby the fish are brought in on these snapper boats and then they're distributed throughout the country. So there's an international and a national market for these fish. And finally, Belize is pretty new to the game, but they're catching up very quickly. The fishery is on a very rapid expansion course, especially among the recreational sector. Overall, we found that most deepwater fishers in the Mesoamerican region reported catching fewer fish than when they first started, but that they would be fishing more in deep waters in the future. And finally, on this, to sum up this section of the presentation, we have project brief and the paper that was published based on these results with a lot more questions and answers in the paper, and they're available on our website, which you can see there. And also we have some project briefs which do some summaries of a lot of the same information that you saw presented just now. Okay, so now that we've found out about the history of the fishery, why it's important to study the fishery, what species are targeted, and we have an idea of the regional dynamics, let's move on to some of the research questions about the actual fish. So this is moving on to the fisheries independent portion of the presentation. Why do we need to do fisheries independent work, and what is fisheries independent work? Essentially, it is a survey that goes out and is, we work with fishers and we hire fishers to do the work with us, but the survey design is based on our survey design, and we can basically go where there are fish, but as well as where there are not fish. Something that you learn after working with fishers for a long time is that fishermen hate not catching fish. And so it's, but they also like to go to new areas where they've never gone before. So essentially, we can go on to areas that it's exciting for the fishers because they've not been there, that they might not have gone to before, because they're not going to spend the fuel to go to these areas. But they also have to stay in the places where there are no fish, because zeros are data too. So one of the reasons why it's important to do this kind of work is that I always use the same kind of gear. I always use the same, the bait when I can, and can find out all kinds of different questions like how many fish are there, how old are they mature, and then when and where are they spawning. In order to do this, we use a couple of methods. The vertical long line, which is similar to what is used in the fishery, is again, I use 5 standard hooks, and I have a surface float, and I leave it to soak for 30 minutes. And then also a baited remote underwater video. This is similar to the shallow water underwater video installments, except that it has special housing. So it has lights on the side and housing for the GoPro. And these methods are designed essentially to be able that I can throw them off of any boat, nearly any boat. I've tried from a dory. Dories are just a bit too small, but essentially any boat that you're able to fish from that size platform, I can deploy this gear from. And we've been doing this surveys in Belize and Honduras from 2015 to 2022. Each fish that we catch is kept, measured, and weighed, and then we assess the reproductive condition, remove the otoliths, which are these little, this will be important a little bit later, sorry, right here, the otoliths. They're removed, extracted from the top of the head after we measure and weigh the fish and assess the reproductive condition. We also take a piece of tissue for genetic analysis, and then we calculate a catch per unit effort, which is the number of individual captures captured per hook hour. And that gives us a measure of the abundance that can be compared across all of our different areas. So here's a map showing all of the captures and the non-captures for groupers and snappers only. This doesn't include sharks or other weirdo fish that we got along the way. So this is from 2015 to 2022. The stars represent bruvs, the squares are the groupers, the circles are the snappers. And so this is the larger map up here on the left, and then we have zoomed in areas of the 3 atolls of Belize, the northern and the southern barrier reef, and then the Bay Islands of Honduras, and then this bank that runs between the Bay Islands of Honduras and the mainland. And then also this is out on western Honduras near Puerto Cortez is further this way. So that's Punta Sal there. So what have we found so far? overall, essentially for every one snapper that I caught in Honduras, I would catch nearly 3.5 in Belize. This is the for all snappers combined, but this is showing the silk snapper, which is called the yellow eye snapper. And this was pretty noticeable across all areas. For sharks, there is one area here in Honduras that is super high in density, and it's especially one kind of shark, a gulper shark. We caught so many, and every time we threw a line down, we would catch between 2 and 5 sharks on the line. And there we got so many in this one area that it basically takes over everything. And so we're counting all the sets with no sharks, which we had a lot of. There are still nearly 3 times the number that we've captured in Honduras than Belize. So there's some really interesting areas. And then we also found that not only are there more fish in Belize, but they're bigger in Belize. So for example, for the queen snapper, which is one of the most heavily sought for fish because it has very high quality, it gets very big. The difference in the average size, so this is the average size of the fish. I caught some that were bigger and some that were smaller, but in Belize, the average size was nearly 15 centimeters larger than in Honduras. This comes on for this species. So this is alternatively called, in Belize, it's champagne snapper. In Honduras, it's chicken snapper, diablo, squirrelfish. I can't remember. There's about 15 other names for this fish. It's the cardinal snapper. And again, we see about a 5 centimeter difference in the average length here between Belize and Honduras. This doesn't seem like a lot. 5 centimeters isn't a lot, but this fish doesn't really get very much bigger than 55 centimeters. So a 5 centimeter difference is pretty outstanding. And then same thing with the yellow eye or silk snapper. We saw that they're on average were larger in Belize than in Honduras. And then again for the black fin snapper. This is among the shallower species of the deepwater species. And I didn't catch a lot of these, but this difference is notable because we got a very, very large blackfin snapper in Honduras that was reported, and even taking into account that large fish, which I'll show you in just a minute, the average size was still larger in Belize. So, and we found that this difference in the size is basically across all waters, and it's more so in Belize. And so when you think about fishing in deep water, you kind of expect that as you go deeper, the fish will be bigger. So on the left-hand side here, this graph, I'll orient you to this graph on the right, on the x-axis on the bottom horizontally, this is depth. So you get deeper as you go to the right, and then as you go up, the fish get bigger. So this represents the size of the fish for the silk, the queen, and the cardinal or champagne snappers. And what we see essentially for the champagne and the queen snappers, we see what we expected, which is that as you go deeper, the fish get bigger, but that essentially this really happens. Hey, yeah, you mostly see this more strongly in Belize. So for example, if we were to look at every depth that we fished, the fish were larger on average in Belize. So if we look at the 250 meter mark, which is about 825 feet, which is represented by the blue line, and then we follow that across to see what the average length of the snapper was. So for the champagne, it was about 43 centimeters in Belize at that depth, whereas it was about 38 centimeters in Honduras. And that becomes even more stark when you get to the queen snapper, which was nearly 20 centimeters different. They don't line up exactly with the lines there, but you get the idea. So that's something that I find very curious, because it's not what I expected. You kind of expect that the deeper waters would be a refuge for these animals, and that's not exactly what we're seeing. So it's something that we need to think about and investigate a little bit further. Okay, so you saw before I mentioned that you needed to pay attention to the otolith, which is the ear bone. So at the top here, and I want to just thank my collaborator Virginia for these slides. So here is an otolith. That's one whole otolith that was from a grouper. And what we do in order to get the age of the fish is to take out a thin section out of the middle. That thin section is then mounted onto a slide, and then you look at it under a microscope, and like the rings of a tree, you can count the bands, and each one of those bands with a translucent and an opaque band would represent 1 year of growth. So these next slides are hot off the press, and they're going to give us a little bit of insight into this fishery, and we can compare it to a little bit of known fish places for the same species in places like the US Caribbean. So firstly, I mentioned that we had that one very, very large blackfin snapper. This was caught by one of our fishers close to Cayos Cochinos. This is actually a record fish. This fish will likely extend the known maximum size of the species. The maximum published size for the species is 75 centimeters, and this one was 85 centimeters. When Dr. Chervet sectioned and counted the bands for this, she estimated it to be 38 years old. The maximum published age for this species in the US Caribbean waters is 27 years old. So that extends the age for this species by a decade. Now, next, the silk snapper or yellow eye snapper. This is the largest silk snapper that I captured during my surveys in Belize, but it is well within the published maximum size for the species. However, talking to the colleagues, we know that in fish areas such as Puerto Rico, the fish are commonly a maximum of 10 years old. But this one was estimated to be 48 years old. So here are all of the bands that are denoted here all the way out to 48. It's old fish. So now we get to the groupers, which we already knew were going to be old. And remember, I told you at the beginning of the presentation that we knew that the yellow edge groupers can be 80 plus years old. This has been validated using, it's called radiocarbon dating, which is has to do with when they set off all of the hydrogen bombs in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And you can actually go back and figure out the year that these animals were born based on those signatures. So I gave a presentation similar to this with more preliminary information a little over a year ago. And one of the fishers called up my colleague, Clara, and said, look, I just got the biggest yellow edge grouper I've ever gotten. It was 60 pounds. Do you want to come and get samples from it? And we said, yes, of course we do. So we managed to get or Clara managed to get the otoliths out, and the early estimate for this fish, and again, that's something that we need to investigate more to make sure that we're counting the right bands. But the first estimate of the age on this species, of this individual, is 86 years old. And this was caught, I think, just north of Glover's Reef. The misty groupers, called mystic groupers, often they kind of fly under the radar. There's not a lot of information on this fish at all. There's one paper that's about a decade old where someone took the otoliths from 2 fish and estimated they were very large fish and estimated that they could be more than 100 years old. And what we're seeing here from the sections that we've gotten from these fish is that they are probably correct and that these are very old fish. So this is this misty grouper here, which was 136 centimeters and is estimated to be 97 years old. So next, I mentioned that we do these baited remote underwater videos using our special hand-deployed little camera. And so this is an example of some of the species that we see on some of our cameras. So our groupers, queen snappers, yellow eye snappers, and 6-gill sharks. So this is a really great method for supplementing the longline data. It's also non-lethal for these species, so we can put it down and see what they're doing. Can get some habitat information about the prey base, so we could see the other individuals that they might be eating, the crabs and the squid and octopus and things like that. So here's the fun presentation part. So I'm just going to show you a couple of clips. So this has given us some novel interactions between species. So we see a little Genie's dogfish there and a snowy grouper. I think you can see who's boss in this situation. And here comes a very large queen snapper. So this is a close to Glover's Reef. And then another shark species, this is a smooth hound. And again, so we've got, a lot of times we think of sharks as being the apex top predators in their ecosystems. But in the deep sea, a lot of times the sharks are actually a lot smaller than we think. And in many cases, they're probably not anywhere close to being the top of the food chain. And they're very much bossed around by the larger fin fish. Here, this one is a video from closer here. This is from Utila. It's a little bit shallower, but you can see we have a very different bottom habitat, same species. So we have that smooth hound again, but a slightly different cast of characters here. These are vermilion snappers or beeliners. In this video, there also were some champagne snappers and some silk snappers, but these are mostly vermilion, which tend to be a schooling fish. And again, you can see most of these fish are pretty much unbothered by shark that's just lurking through. What's nice about this is we can also see some whip coral, some hard coral, like I said, a different substrate type, and some plant materials down here. So what does this all mean? Well, we found essentially that the fishery in Belize is not fully established. Of course, there are fewer people, fewer fishers in Belize, so that's expected. And there's also not the strong export market for, or large export market for these deep water fish. The nearshore coast of the Bay Islands is probably pretty highly exploited. But there might be some refuges that are protected by essentially the weather, because the bank that's between the Bay Islands and the mainland is open water, and especially right now the easter winds are going. There's nobody out there fishing right now, so there might be some refuges out there that are protected essentially by the habitat. However, the overfishing in the Bay Islands makes it more difficult for fishers that are sustainable for subsistence fishing to actually go out and catch the fish. And if these fish are really as old as we are starting to estimate that they are, they might be more vulnerable to exploitation than we thought. So to show you an example, so the top photo is some of our surveys in Belize. And I'm not saying that this is what we catch every time we go fishing in Belize or sampling in Belize. It's not necessarily typical, but it's not unusual to have a day like this where you have 5 hooks and 5 large fish, these large queen snappers. But this is very common in the Bay Islands of the size of the fish that we get. And you see we're even doing some forced perspective here on this side. This is not a very big fish at all. And remember that we need those big fish. We need those boffs to maintain the population. We need lots of high quality babies in order to keep this fishery going. So not to keep dragging on about this, but for example, here again is this similar slide to beginning, which shows our average size of the fish that I captured in Belize versus Honduras. And here is the maximum size that that fish gets. So really, you can see that there's a stark contrast here. And if we overlay the estimated size at maturity, which is this gray line here, we can see we're just barely hitting above that size of maturity in Honduras. And really, all of the fishing needs to be happening well above that size of maturity in order for the population to maintain itself. And then remember, once these big fish are gone, it can take 50 more years for the groupers. It can take 80 years to replace those big animals. So the ideas for conservation and sustainability, this is an ongoing conversation with managers, with fishers. But I think that probably closed areas make the most sense, or at least closed seasonal closed areas, much like you do for the seasonal spawning aggregations of groupers. And also during the times of, especially during the time of spawning, which in the case for most of these species is in the fall months, so August until November, more or less November, which actually aligns very well with the northern countries, because the fishers are usually not fishing it during that time because they're fishing for lobster. But in Honduras, it means that the fishers would be losing out on their preferred time of fishing. Also, there's a lot of opportunity for marketing to really high level consumers, like sushi restaurants. This is a restaurant in San Pedro. This is a champagne snapper. He filleted the fish in front of us, put it out as nigiri, and then a different seared dish there. These are high quality fish. In the Pacific, the queen snappers get $15 to $17 a pound. So there's some opportunity here for elevating this market. And also, especially in Belize, utilizing the entire, getting value added by using the entire fish rather than selling just the fillet. And then this is just to show it here in Honduras, the prices that you get between the yellowtail and the red snapper, the deepwater snapper, are more or less the same. So the fishers aren't seeing more value, despite the fact that it costs more, it's more effort, and you use more fuel to fish in deep water than you do for fishing for yellowtail. And then finally, we need to leave the groupers alone. We need to find areas where those groupers are and try to let them be, because they're going to disappear pretty quickly. And we saw that in the Bay Islands, especially here. This is the only grouper that I captured in Honduras one. So where are the important areas for conservation? Well, I'm still figuring that out. We're still investigating. We're still talking to fishers. But for now, I think we should probably be focusing on where the groupers are and where we know that spawning has occurred. So the circles show where the groupers are. The arrows show where we know have known spawning locations. And we know that they spawn in the fall months. So setting those areas aside during August to November could help out those species. And it could also have knock-on effects for other species, not just the groupers. So also thinking about protected areas and extending those into the deep and setting them aside as no-take areas. And then for instance, in the Bay Islands, the protected areas extend off of the coast and into deep waters, but actually they only extend down to 60 meters of depth. They don't go to the sea floor. So that's another consideration for management. So what's happening now, we're actively working to validate the ages of the cardinal snappers using that radiocarbon analysis that I mentioned previously. We're looking into the genetic connectivity of the silk snappers and maybe the cardinal snappers. And that's going to help us to determine not only the important areas for the fish, because if they're highly connected, if these fish are moving around a lot, if they're spawning and the spawn is moving around through the region, then they're much less vulnerable to overexploitation. Whereas if they're spawning and not moving and everybody's staying in one area, if you fish that population out, it's gone. But if the spawn is moving, or if the fish, a lot of the fishers say that the queen snappers move around a lot. So if those fish are moving, then they're more resilient to local extirpation. And also we're still looking for those spawning areas and trying to find those important areas for these, especially for the groupers and for the snappers. However, we're going to focus more this year and moving forward on the camera work and less on the extractive hook work, partly because we don't want to be killing these 80, 100-year-old fish. And we'll also be working with at the hydrophone to see if we can hear some action going on down there. And don't forget about the sharks. I started this project trying to catch sharks, and I ended up catching a bunch of fish, and that moved me into this whole project. But there's still actually several species of sharks that have not been identified in the region. And for instance, this species is the Atlantic six-gill shark. It was only recently described in 2018. There's still a lot of work to be done. I'd like to put out satellite tags and things like that. So there's lots of other work to be done in the deep sea. And then with that, I think I would like to thank MARFund for hosting this webinar and also for funding large aspects of the project, and then all of our other funders and our partners.
Thank you, Ivy, so much. What a nice broad information. It's a lot of data and information.
There's a test.
That's that you need to pile up and analyze at the end. So really interesting. Congratulations, and a lot of success for the next part of the project. So let's see if we have any question from our guests.
I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Lisa from the Reef Keeper Belize. She says, given the interest in alternative livelihood in Belize and interest in deep water fisheries, what concern do you have for increasing overfishing in Belize for these long-lived fish?
I have a lot of concerns. And it is actually one of the reasons why we're doing this comparison between Belize and Honduras, because I think that in many cases, we are looking into the future of the Belizean deepwater fishery, where the fish are smaller and less abundant. Because in Honduras, the fishery was established in the 1970s. Most fishers were, they were taught to fish by their fathers or an older generation. So this fishery has been exploited for longer. The Belizean fishery is not been exploited for a very long time. But again, it's not the habitat for the fish. The available fishing area is small. It's a narrow band. You get from 100 meters to 500 meters very quickly in most of the regions. And so I think there needs to be a precautionary approach to this fishery.
Thank you, Ivy. I can see Arlene has her hands up. Maybe Arlene, you can, yes, put your mic on. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, Ivy. I have
Hi.
a question. The conch and the lobster that are found in deeper waters, I want to know how deep are those waters and if the Belizean fishermen actually catch them.
I don't know that there is specifically a deep water conch or lobster species. I don't know that I honestly, I don't know. I don't think that there is a deep water conch. If they are, they probably got there accidentally and didn't make their way back up to shallow water. I know that the lobsters go fairly deep, but that's just the lobster fishery in Honduras. They're on hookah or they're diving multiple times a day on tanks to get the fish. It's not a free diving fishery. But I don't know the answer to that question, what the bottom limit is for those. Anybody else here might?
Okay.
But I never see any lobster or conch at 100 meters on any of my surveys, any of the cameras.
Yes, please, if you have more information, we can use the chat and share with the entire group the information that you might have that might be useful for Ivy as well. Ivy, we have another question from Amitaya Revalo. I hope I see the name correctly. Other than overfishing, what are the environmental concerns you have when overfishing and doing the process of deep water fishing?
Overfishing is the primary concern. I do see a bit of plastic pollution. I've seen more than one hermit crab that has a bottle or a can as its shell. The climate change is a very interesting question because of the depth and the temperature preferences. We've actually found that the fish are more related to the temperature than the depth. They're also obviously very highly correlated, the depth and the temperature, but actually the temperature preferences might be what actually drives where the fish are. So if there are major disruptions in the currents and the temperature distribution, I could see that being a problem for the fish. And in a lot of cases where especially in places like the Arctic, the deep water fisheries, the distribution actually shifts for those bottom fish based on the temperature profile. So if there is a major disruption in the current, the loop current that comes up, I could see that having a big impact on the fish as well.
Okay, thank you, Ivy. I hope if you also need more information from Ivy, we can share Ivy's emails and you can get in contact with her for information on deep fisheries in Honduras and Belize, as well as reading the document that Ivy shared with us on the recent investigations and research that they have been doing in the latest few years. We have congratulations from you, Ivy, and very happy everyone to be here with you. So we have comments from Facebook, Alexander Portillo and Eloy Sosa saying hi and congrats. And we have another question. I think it's not a question, but maybe you can help us out saying if you think is the same feeling that you have with the information that you collect. Eloy Sosa says, I think deep water still is functioning as a refugium in Belize and southern Mexico because there are no big fleets fishing in deep water. In Mexico, most oil fishing is by free diving and spear. That's something you have said, right? That we don't have big fisheries
Correct.
up in the north. Yeah. Breed is asking Ivy, apologies if I missed this. Who is Honduras porting to? Do you have the information?
Who is Honduras? Sorry.
Sporting to the fisher, the fish.
Oh, I honestly don't know.
Okay.
There are a few fabricas. There's one in Utila. There's some in La Ceiba and Puerto Cortez, but I don't know the markets for those.
Okay. Thanks. Maybe we can get more information on that on next projects as well to see where the fish goes and how big they export
Yes,
it.
Mark, exactly.
Yeah. For your information, says Lisa, Reef Keeper Belize also educates about Goliath grouper in the Belizean classroom to create awareness of its status and importance, which is a very, very important thing to say that like on the side on reporting this information and do research, we need to educate the community, right, Ivy? And I think it's
Oh, absolutely.
you do.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. And also something to note, and it's been studied in the Goliath grouper, the fish that are greater than 50 centimeters have more mercury than is recommended for regular consumption, especially among pregnant women and children. So it's actually not safe to eat these really big groupers. And with consistency, you don't want to eat them especially every day or every week. We don't know what the mercury level is of the deeper water species, but something that lives for 100 years, they probably have been accumulating it for a very long time. So it's very likely that these animals that get to be very big are actually not very safe to eat in a high quantity.
Okay, thank you, Ivy. Another question on the chat here from Amisai. Do fishers of Belize will be doing the deep water fishing and training will be issued, or foreign investors will bring their own people? Oh, good
I
question.
don't. Are there people from fisheries that I know that the MCAP program trained fishers in Belize and provided them with equipment to including ice boxes and in order to be able to maintain the quality of the product. I think that was 20, I believe that was 20 fishers that participated in that project. I think that there is a plan to continue to provide gear and training to fishers, but I don't know the ins and outs of that.
I don't know if the question from Ansai was related to your project. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it. I don't know. Let's see. I don't know, but you have trained fishers to collect this information, right?
We train
So
fishers to conduct the research. Exactly. Yes, exactly. So to conduct research, but that's not necessarily to transition into deep water fishing. Most of the fishers that we work with, they have not. We hired them because they have knowledge. They've already been deep sea fishing. They have knowledge of the gear and the environment. So it helps us because we're actually learning from them.
Yes, and this adds to the project as well.
Exactly.
So I will just leave a few seconds more if someone else wants to write their question. We are short in time, but we'll try to respond all questions, and maybe if you can stay a little bit longer, we can do that smoothly. Just to remind everyone, please, if you could not follow the entire webinar, we are gonna share the recordings of this webinar in the next few weeks in our website, and we will share with you also a link for a form. So maybe you can send us some feedbacks on those webinars and the information shared by Ivy in this case today. So yes, please also, if you did not write down your name and organization, please do so before leaving the webinars. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We'll stay a little bit longer to respond and continue this conversation. Thank you, everyone. So Mauro,
Thanks,
you have your hands up. So yes, please share your
Thank
question.
you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. This is Mauro Gongora from Fisheries Department. I noted with interest the depth at which the study was carried out, and if I'm not mistaken, it was 250 meters, right? Up to
It was
250 meters.
between 100 meters and 500 meters.
Oh, 100 and 500 meters.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that your findings were basically in line with what we have found out from our test fishing operations. And yes, the AIMCAP project, someone asked about training. And we did some training with the few fishers that we have, maybe around 35, 40 fishers, not more than that. It's a small fishery in development, as you pointed out, but there's no rapid expansion, Ivy. I beg to differ in terms of that statement, because it's the recreational fishers have always been there, and these are the rich people, right? These are not artisanal small scale poor fishermen. These are rich kids that do a lot of playing out in the seas, getting fishing. Um, uh, they should actually get some commercial fishing licenses, because they're not actually doing just recreational fishing in terms of catching and release. They're actually taking the catch home. So these are commercial fishers, and this is a concern for us for quite some time, that which should be regulated, and it will be regulated sometime later, either this year or early next year. But yes, I wanted to comment on the fact that the species that you are that you mentioned, the queen snapper, the champagne, the LOI, the black fin snapper, those are species of commercial importance to us. And while your information that you have provided in terms of these species being long-lived, slow-growing, and late maturing, we're also considering that the shallow water lobster and conch fishery has over the years been subjected to high fishing efforts. And so what the government is doing in fisheries, particularly through the fisheries department, is we're trying to diversify the sector so that we could reduce fishing effort in these shallow water fisheries. And the fisheries policy and action plan actually calls for further development of the sector and expansion of the sector. But at this stage, it is small scale, really. You could literally count the number of fishers who are involved in deep slope fishing, and we would be happy to engage Marfund in some training, additional training for fishers, so that we could gather the information, the catch and effort data, and even biological data from the fishers themselves. And so this is something that we are also interested in. And if Marfund has resources available, we could sit down and have a conversation as to how best we can work this out. Thank you. That is my comment, Ivy. Thanks. Bye bye.
Thank you, Mauro. Yeah, no, that's great. And thank you for speaking up. And I agree. The recreational sector is a very different group of fishers, but like you said, they are commercializing the catch. They're also the ones that are mostly catching the grouper, because the big groupers, because they have the depth sounder, they have the GPS, they have the phone app that tells them where the banks are. And even though it's not a big sector and it's not a whole lot of them, we've seen in a lot of cases, especially those groupers, that can drive the population down, especially for a century living fish. So you do, I think you definitely, the tour guides, they go out and they do deep drops when they don't have something else to do with their guests, or when the season is slow. So yeah, I agree with that. And it's fantastic news to hear that there's more information that will be gathered on the sizes and the species in the fishery.
Thank you so much, Mauro and Ivy. Yes, please, Mauro, you can write us down an email and we can see what can we do to collaborate. I think it's very important to connect and to collaborate and put the data together, because we are a region, we are a system, and more data, more information is useful to see and understand the pattern of the distribution of the fishes in this case. So thank you so much. I have Eloisa, I think, responded to Arleni, but I think we missed her. Deepwater fish, water deeper than 60 meters are too cold for spiny lobster and queen conch. That might be one of the answer for that question. Also, Ivy, we have another collaboration here with Melanie from HRI. Would be nice to share the map if possible, because she said the map of this limited deep water habitat surprising to her. Please share the square meter of this habitat in each country. Let's also compare fully and highly protected area with within this zone. So
Great.
that could be like another point in common, right? To
Yes.
share information if possible.
Yes.
Thank
Send me,
you. Ivy.
yes, send me an
Yes.
email and I can provide that.
Yeah, I think it's good that if you don't have Ivy email, or you can reach her through our social media, Mar Alliance, or you can ask us and we can make the connection. So I think we have a couple of few questions. I don't want to take much of your time. We'll take 3 more and then we'll close the webinar. Keel here is asking you, Ivy, do you think it is possible to farm or culture these deep water fish to extend the longevity and ensure survival? That's a really
Wow.
tough question.
That is a tough question, because from what I know about the life histories, they spawn at depth, and then the larvae actually spend something like 45 to 60 days drifting around until they settle out. And so you could potentially harvest the larvae using a trawl and then maybe acclimate them to a depth that wasn't quite so deep. So it would be very complicated. That's probably, I don't know that anybody has tried to do an culture of a deep water species, but it would be difficult.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I know of grouper fishing, grouper aquaculture in Taiwan, but they collect like and do reproduction inland. It's not
Right,
in the
yeah.
sea. But it's very technical and very tough. They have their own system. It's very, it's
to
possible,
think about. Yeah.
but yeah, we have to go there and see.
Wow. Yeah.
Andrew Castillo is asking, there should be also concern about development on the mainland and the case as this has an effect on our fish stock. These include mangrove clearing, seagrass clearing, etc., etc.
Absolutely. And we see I think a lot of times we think of the deep sea as just being like, well, just throw things in there and we'll never see it again. And in the case of dredging and things like that, a lot of times it's just sort of dumped out there into these habitats. But what we're finding more and more is that there are lots of very fragile ecosystems in the deep sea. There are deep water corals, sponges, millions of species that live down there. A lot of these animals actually move into shallow waters at night and they move back down during the day into deeper waters. And so they're passing all of these different habitats, which are all very specialized. So, and everything, like I said, I've seen several cases of lots of plastic pollution, cans, things like that, animals living in trash and things like that, even at these depths. So everything definitely is connected. And it has negative impact on even the deep waters.
Correct. So the main issue here is that we need to protect not just the ocean, right? You have to think about everything from the reef to the reef, right? So the idea is that what we do at Marfan is to take into consideration that and support projects so that the effect can be seen into the reef and see rising on fish population, coral coral, how do you say that?
The restoration or?
yeah, coral restoration, but so the coral could rise, right?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And similar things, or work with community fisher, train them, acknowledge the information, and let them do something better to the reef. So I think that's it. There was a question from Vivia Palacio. I do not have the answer for that. We don't really monitor fisheries quotas, but we collect the information from the national government. So maybe you can send us, Vivia, an email so we can try to find out a better response to this question. Sorry about that. But yes, Ivy, thank you so much for
Thank you, Lisa.
everything. Sorry to keep you a bit late today, but there are so many questions still unanswered, and we hope you can at least try a couple of response or finding information that you can share with us at the end of this project. So thank you
Absolutely.
so much. Congratulations to you and the entire team. And thank you everyone for being here today with us. Yes.